Welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Segel, I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. You know I got to do it, right? I got to talk about Joe Biden's apology. And, there's so many, pieces to this because, I've talked at length and perhaps ad nauseum over Deb Haaland and Brian Newland's final report on residential schools. And for me to regurgitate all of that and to reiterate what a travesty that report was is probably not necessary, although I'll probably touch on a few points here as I go on with this subject matter. What I will say is that the report that came from the Interior Department, the Department of Interior, Deb Haaland's Department of Interior, it called for 8 recommendations. And of course, the first recommendation was an apology. So anybody who's shocked that this apology came, look, of the 8 recommendations, this is the easiest one. This is the one that requires no money. It requires no investment. It requires no real energy. What it did require was somebody to write up a speech for him, and then vet that entire apology through legal counsel and everything else. And I'm going to dissect a little bit of it. And look, I know there are a bunch of Native people out there who just were, just absolutely enthralled and thrilled that a U.S. president apologized for residential schools. I get it. I honestly do. I get it. But ask a Native Hawaiian how they felt about an apology from 1993. And ask about what these apologies really mean, because they mean nothing. Now, I know, again, the same crowd that was so enthusiastic when Biden put a Native person in as the head of the Interior Department are basically the same ones who are just beside themselves with joy over this apology. And again, let me be clear. We shouldn't be. I mean, there's nothing in an apology that should make you happy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's nothing that should elicit that kind of emotional response. For one thing, what an apology is, it's a request. When you apologize for something, you are requesting forgiveness. Now, there's a big question in my mind on who he was apologizing to, and I'll get into that a little bit. But he was asking for forgiveness from us, from Native people. Look, we know he went to Arizona, and let me tackle that right off the bat. Let's tackle that right from the beginning. Less than 2 weeks before the presidential election, where the Democrats are desperate and desperate not to lose to Donald Trump again. They go to a swing state with the largest Native population of any of the states. And certainly, as far as swing states go. There's a lot of conversation about places like Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin. But Arizona clearly has a large Native population. So you go to a swing state with a large Native population and you make this kind of overture. If that is not politically motivated, and if you don't believe that it's politically motivated, then you're lying to yourself. This was a gesture in an attempt to win votes. Now, for me, to use our suffering, 150 years of our suffering, to win over some votes, especially to win over some votes that perhaps you are concerned you aren't going to win without this. That if you don't capitalize on making an apology for, yeah, we can argue about how long overdue it is. We can have that discussion. But to suggest that it was not only long overdue, but it was due right now, I'm sorry. I think it's obscene. I think it is obscene to issue this apology in a swing state less than 2 weeks before the presidential election. And many should be ashamed of themselves. Now, I don't expect any shame out of the president of the United States. I don't expect any shame out of the U.S. at all, because I've been calling for shame on them for decades now. I mean, it's the work that I do. But shame on any of you Native people who are just praising. I mean, I heard one guy step up and say, Joe Biden is the greatest president that Native people have ever had. I mean, that's how extreme this thing is. And for what? For words? For just offering some words? Now let me get into the apology. So again, but make no mistake about it, this was a political stunt. The genuineness and the sincerity of this apology is evident in the words, in what the apology was. First off, we always talk about this whole separation of church and state thing. What Joe Biden called this 150 years of genocide wasn't genocide. No, he never used even that word. In fact, he never even used the word criminal or crime. He did use the word sin. So, as this Catholic president stood up to a podium in Arizona, he referred to this policy of killing the Indian, save the man. And I can't emphasize enough that that's not a metaphor. Metaphors do not require graveyards. Metaphors do not require burials. Mass graves, unmarked graves, or marked graves. Metaphors don't require that. Dead children require that. That's what took place in these schools. Now, I will say that Biden did go through a laundry list of the offenses, of the atrocities, and hearing them, you think, well, how easy it would have been for him to say that it was a crime, that the residential schools represented a crime, because he listed a series of crimes: sexual abuse, physical abuse, death of children, the kidnapping and stealing of children. In fact, as I've said so many times about what the word genocide really is defined as, and it is defined as 5 acts, specific acts, that any one of them is genocide, that are perpetrated with the intent to destroy a people. Now, look, if you come out of the gate with a policy that is described as kill the Indian, save the man, even if you throw words like, well, kill the Indian within him, you're still talking about eliminating a piece of a person or the whole person in the attempt to destroy those people. You're talking about wiping out a distinct people. Now, you may be suggesting that if you could just eliminate their culture and their identity and replace it with another identity, then you might have a valuable human being after all is said and done. But you know what? That's considered a war crime too. Before the word genocide was ever even coined and described and defined, the rest of the world looked at denationalization as a war crime. The idea of stripping away somebody's cultural character, national character, and imposing another nation's character upon them, that was a crime. It still is a crime. Now, it gets wrapped up into the definition of genocide. And let me be clear again, genocide requires intent. Intent is a foregone conclusion when you build an entire policy around the idea of killing at least in whole or in part, an individual's identity, an individual. So the 5 acts are causing death, killing people, causing death. Now, that death may be caused by murder, but it also may be caused by creating conditions that death was welcome. So, causing children to kill themselves, neglecting children, malnourishing children, refusing to give them proper medical attention. All of those things are intentional. If you know that a plague has swept across the continent, whether it's the Spanish flu or whether it's typhoid fever or whether it's tuberculosis, whatever it is, if you know there's a contagion out there, and that the first and foremost thing that you need to do is to quarantine children, and then don't, that's causing death. That's not just carelessness, that's intentional neglect. It's a prosecutable offense all by itself, even if you don't do it within the context of genocide. So causing death is one of them. The other one is causing serious physical injury. And that serious physical injury, Joe Biden said it. It included physical injury. It included psychological abuse, sexual abuse. That much of that physical abuse ultimately led to children dying. Because if they didn't get proper medical attention when they were being beaten and punished by being deprived food and proper medical care. But many kids survived it. But I got to tell you, there were periods of time during this 150 years that the mortality rate was above 50%. Half of the children in some of these schools were dying. I mean, and that's just a matter of fact. Facts that aren't really disclosed in Deb Haaland and Brian Newland's report, I might add. So causing death and causing injury. Those are two of the 5 acts. The other one is a little bit more non-specific. It says deliberately inflicting conditions on a people that will cause them to be destroyed in whole or in part. So what does that mean? Well, this is the one that I think people kind of defer to when they say things like cultural genocide. And to be clear, there's no such thing as cultural genocide. There's genocide. But if part of that genocide is being conducted against the people by stripping away, sometimes physically, but also through the use of torture and abuse and beatings and that kind of stuff, stripping away a culture, destroying language, taking any items that could be associated with Native identity. If you take those away and destroy them, burn them, rip away their clothes, cut their hair off, change their names, then teach them to be Christians through a series of aggressive indoctrination, and you enslave those children by making them work the fields and become housemaids for white folks. If you do those things, and along the way, you don't just strip those things away, you invest and you inflict upon these children the notion that what you believe as far as who you were, what your identity is, that it was wrong, it was bad, it was evil, it was satanic. If you tell children the very things that they have been already introduced to as children make them bad, make them evil, sinful, that the act of being a Native person is a sin, if that's what you do, you've not only, look, you didn't just take a blank slate and then show them a better way. The first thing you did was tell them how bad they were. That's deliberately implementing conditions to destroy a people. That's 3 of them. The other 2, one of them is doing anything that interferes with reproductive rights. Taking young girls and sterilizing them, making them incapable, unable physically. So I'm talking about surgery, taking young girls and making it so they could not have children. Sterilization, that's what I'm talking about here. Sterilization. And this was mostly done to girls, not to boys. And the target of this, and this wasn't just at the schools, this was through Indian Health Services, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, all of that, right? The target of this was primarily full-bloods. Well, why would that be? Well, they figured if a girl was already a half-breed, then they were already on their way to wiping out some of that distinction. I mean, this was a logic. This was a strategy. So sterilization, that was the fourth one. What's the fifth one? The fifth one was the entire act of taking a child and removing them from one group and placing them in another group. This was both accomplished by taking children and putting them in these schools that were more like prisons or indoctrination centers. But it was also done through the adoption program, the foster care program. Many of these children were put to work. So when we talk about adoption and foster care, we aren't talking about, oh, these children are going to be placed in a loving home. No. You know, the entire Truth and Reconciliation effort in Maine was not about residential schools. It was about foster care. It was about the abuses that Native children went through foster care and adoption. So no, these children weren't whisked away from these terrible schools and then placed into loving homes. I'm not saying none were. But for the most part, by and large, this was abuse of children at another level, at another location. This was a part of the fifth act that was deliberate in its intent to destroy Native people. And there's no question about that. So that's what defines genocide. Now, if this sounds like the playbook for residential schools, it's kind of a coincidence, believe it or not. Genocide as a coined word and as defined in the international community was not built or constructed or defined with us at the center of attention here. We had nothing to do with it. Native people had nothing to do with developing the concept of genocide. I mean just as a concept. I don't mean the implementation. Obviously, we were the victims of it. No, the genocide was developed both as a transition from this concept of denationalization, the idea of stripping away somebody's national character and imposing another. But after World War II, after, the Nazis and what they did to, not just the Jews, by the way, what they did to the Moors and what they did to all of the other people, the people they called gypsies. What Hitler and the Nazis were doing, which was this idea of implanting this notion of a master race and perpetrating crimes against humanity against anybody who wasn't part of that master race. That's part of where this term genocide came out of. The fact that every aspect, every act that is considered genocide was what was perpetrated at these residential schools should make it an easy leap for anyone, including even Joe Biden, even the doddering old fool Joe Biden. But you know what? His legal counsel was going to let him call it a crime. The legal counsel wasn't going to let him use the word genocide. By the way, the word genocide shows up nowhere. It doesn't only not show up anywhere in Deb Haaland and Brian Newland's report. If you search the word genocide on the Department of Interior website, the response you get is no results found. I mean, is that impossible to believe? No results found. So I got to go back and ask, is an apology that doesn't ever call this heinous activity a crime? Is it genuine? Is it sincere? And what is it, again, talking about the separation of church and state, what is it that allows a guy to stand up there who's a devoted Catholic, supposedly, and call this a sin, a blot against America, but a sin against our souls, is what he said. If you can call it a sin and consider that within the context of your religious beliefs, but never address it as a crime, and never address it as the crime that it was, which was genocide, I'm sorry. I'm apologizing, right? No, it's simply not an acceptable apology. And look, within our culture, and I've said it, I posted this, within our culture, there is no concept of apologies or forgiveness. Look, there's justice. I mean, we talk about how you resolve a conflict, but it isn't resolved by saying you're sorry. In fact, within the church, it isn't either. There's this thing called the act of contrition, which is very much a part of Catholicism. Where's Joe Biden's act of contrition? Just saying the words. And again, maybe this sounds like nitpicking. He actually didn't apologize to us. He apologized for what they did. So who is the apology to? His God? His God who he was acknowledging that the act was a sin? Because if you start using a religious, terminology, so who is he apologizing to? So who is he asking forgiveness from? Us? Yeah, you went to Arizona. But you went there and apologized to your God? So was this like a confession without any act of, in the church, they call acts of contrition, the prayers that you have to say. We're going to tell you to say, 5 Our Fathers and, 20 Hail Marys, and maybe you do a rosary or two. For those of you who know what I'm talking about, if you know, you know. If you don't, I'm not going to go through my background knowledge associated with Catholicism. But yeah, so you have to do something. You have to do some act. In what would be a true act of contrition, when you acknowledge a wrong was done, you do something to correct that wrong. Now, Deb Haaland may list an apology as one of those items that are part of the correction, but is it really? I mean, is saying you're sorry for what you did without even directing your apology to us? Are you asking us for forgiveness? Because that's not in my vocabulary. I'm it's just not. And I don't say that to sound crass or unsophisticated. I would argue there's a level of sophistication by pursuing restorative justice. I wore my land back shirt today for this, because restoration of land is one of the acts of contrition that the United States should be doing. You can't give us the lives back that you stole. You can't even give us the lives back that you harmed and that you destroyed, because you didn't just kill children. You permanently inflicted trauma that would ultimately be intergenerational trauma. Let's think about this again. 150 years. So we aren't talking about targeting a narrow group of people, a narrow demographic. You're talking about 7 generations of Native people as children, before they would actually, in many cases, before they would actually be taught their culture, the first thing they were taught was that it was bad. I mean, that's the reality of it all. The first thing that they were taught was who you are is wrong, and we're going to kill a part of you. We're going to remove a certain part of who you think you are. And if you survive it, we're going to call you a human being. But in the absence of removing the Indian, killing the Indian within you, you're not a human being. See, it says kill the Indian, save the man. What they mean is kill the identity, kill who we are. So in the views, in the perspective of white people, because that's who we're talking about here. We're talking about white people. If you can strip away the Indianness, then a human being can come out the other side. But with that Indianness, with that identity, you're less than human. How do I know? Because the United States was, during this period of time, keep in mind, no children were considered U.S. citizens when this program was really established. The Carlisle Indian School, which only operated for 39 years, it was done by 1919. No children who went to Carlisle Indian School were U.S. citizens, including Jim Thorpe, who represented the United States in the Olympics. And when he did that, still wasn't a U.S. citizen. He would be granted U.S. citizenship later. Jim Thorpe also never graduated from Carlisle Indian School. 10,500 students went through Carlisle Indian School in that 40 years. Over 10,000 children went to Carlisle Indian School. Their flagship school. This is where the expression was coined. Killed the Indian, saved the man. Richard Henry Pratt. I think they call him Colonel Richard Henry Pratt. He's the one who said, we're going to kill the Indian within them so we can save the man. Always male dominance, right? None of the children who went to Carlisle Indian School were U.S. citizens. So, I mean, it actually begs the question, what right could you do, or what right did you have to take children who weren't even yours? You weren't even your citizens. Well, you had already been promoting this concept that we were wards of the federal government, that somehow we were like property. Oh no! Didn't property get done away with didn't human property get done away with the 14th Amendment back in 1865? No, it didn't. This whole period of time, 150 years, from 1819 to 1969, this whole period of time, Native children were being treated as a commodity, as a raw material that, if machined just the right way, might have some value. Might not even survive it. Kill the Indian, save the man. Yeah, like I said, it wasn't a metaphor. Some of them died. Some of them died brutal, lonely deaths. Yeah, that's what happened at these schools. So an apology just doesn't get it done. And for those of you who praise Joe Biden for doing this, because no president in the history of the United States has ever apologized for this, there's a reason they haven't. Especially if they're a sitting president that might have to do more. Joe Biden doesn't have to do anything more. This is it. He did what he had to do, right? He checked the one box, one of 8 recommendations made by his Indian princess, who he put up as the Interior Secretary. He's not going to be around long enough, folks. I mean, I'm not talking about morbidity here. I'm talking about as the president of the United States. Next week, he becomes a lame duck, regardless of who wins. I mean, he's essentially done. I mean, yeah, he can issue some pardons. I wouldn't expect Leonard Peltier on that list, by the way. Yeah, you can expect some pardons in the final months of his presidency as a lame duck. But he is not going to do any of the other 7 recommendations, which by themselves are a travesty. Again, let me at least visit those. I'm not going to go through the lowballing numbers too much. But let me just say this. If you're going to look at Carlisle Indian School as the flagship of the boarding schools, this was the model. Even though some already existed, and many would exist long after 1919 or 1918, whatever they finally closed the place. 10,000 children went to this one school. Deb Haaland says, well, we've only been able to define and establish and confirm that 18,000 children were forced into these schools. What? You think that only another 8,000 students? You were only able to verify another 8,000 students beyond the 10,000 who went to Carlisle? You had 417 boarding schools. They existed for 150 years, and you come up with a number like 18,000? And look, I know you said it's probably more. It's at least 18,000, probably more. Not probably more, definitely more. If you added a zero to that and called it 180,000, it would still be short. There were periods of time that 80% of the known native children had been ripped from their homes. Now, I'm not saying that was true for the whole 150 years. But there were periods of time that 80% of native children had been ripped from their homes to go to these schools. Or, this is the other thing, there was over 100 state-run and privately run boarding schools that were doing the same thing. They were fulfilling the same policy of the United States, including right here in Seneca Territory, the Thomas Indian School. It was actually at some point considered one of the worst. Didn't start out that way. But by the time New York State had full control under their board of charities of that school, the kids were called inmates. They were called irredeemable. They were considered handicapped, disabled, simply because they were native. Being native was a malady, and they knew that they could never make those children whole. That's what they built. That's what they knew. That's what they believed. At best, we could teach them some rudimentary skills, and maybe they could have some value in their society. Because as native children, they had none. They had no value. This is the Christian nation you're talking about? Yeah. So 417 federally funded and federally created boarding schools. Another 120 or so state-run or privately run boarding schools. And you're going to suggest that only 18,000 kids were forced into these schools? Probably more. Because these are the numbers that get repeated. Joe Biden didn't say that there were 10,000 children killed in these schools. No, he said, we know there was 1,000 killed, probably more. But the number that gets perpetrated and continues and repeated over and over again is 18,000 kids going to the schools, 1,000 died in them. Those numbers are paltry figures for the truth. It's probably going to be closer to 30 or 40,000 students or kids. I hate to say, I'm sorry, I always say students because these were supposedly schools, but they weren't students. They were children who were inmates. That's what New York State called them, inmates. It'll probably be closer to 30,000 children who died in these schools if there's ever a full investigation, which, by the way, is not one of the recommendations. Of those 8 recommendations, okay, 7 because we checked that one box. And we didn't really check the box because that box said apologize and fully acknowledge what was done. If you didn't use the word crime and genocide, you didn't fully acknowledge it. So you didn't even really fully check the one box. But those 7 other recommendations don't include searching for the missing children. It doesn't include looking for mass and unmarked graves. It also doesn't include coming up with any just reparations for what was done to the survivors, to the families. There's no part of the recommendations that suggests that damages to us need to be done. Now, in the report, and I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again, in the report, they do suggest that when you do an analysis on how much the United States spent on residential schools and adjust it for inflation, that there's a number. Now, this is what they did with this report. They came up with a number. That number was $23.3 billion. That's how much the United States spent in the commission of this crime that would continue. You know, it's funny when you say a crime, a crime sounds like an event, like this thing happened. No, the crime of genocide has a term to it, has a period of time, because genocide doesn't get done one day. Genocide is a policy, and in this case, a 150-year policy. So they calculated how much they spent. And actually, let me back that up a little bit. They didn't actually calculate the first 50 years. They only calculated the last 100 years of this genocide. And they came up with $23.3 billion. And many people oohed and ahed. Wow, that's a lot of money. I even heard one person in a news broadcast say, well, it wouldn't have to be paid out. No, it won't be paid out. Because what Hallen was suggesting is that $23.3 billion an equivalent figure should be used to make this right, to fulfill those 8. Apology didn't cost anything, so fulfill the 7 recommendations. So they didn't ever assess the damages that were inflicted upon us. They just assessed the cost to inflict those damages. I mean, it's an absurd proposition, but that's what was done. So when I see an apology offered, when I see the President of the United States going to a swing state that his party is desperately in need of in the election next week, making overtures to Native people, and then getting all this praise heaped upon them. Look, and let's talk about Arizona. Arizona is a state that, by some accounts, the Native vote made all the difference for Joe Biden. Allegedly, the Native vote swung Arizona to the Democrats in 2020. And I say allegedly because I think it's BS. Look, if you look at the Native population, the people you hear from are guys like me, activists, or maybe celebrities. Think about the white population, or even the black population. I mean, whatever population. It's the activists and the celebrities that you hear from. You don't hear from Grandpa, unless he's an activist or a celebrity. Well, it's the same thing in our culture, in our population. Look, you hear from the activists. And yes, the activists and the celebrities, and I'll put myself in that box, we do lean to the left. I'm not saying we vote, but I'm saying that if you were to try to evaluate which way we lean politically, not in U.S. politics, just politically in general, yes, we are more progressive. Yes, we believe in freedoms. Yes, we believe in all the things that liberals, essentially, many of the things that liberals believe in. So, if that's who you hear from, but do you hear from the veterans? Again, much to my own chagrin, Native people enlist in the armed forces at a higher rate than any other pocket of population within the United States. The highest. Which way do veterans lean politically? There's no question which way veterans lean politically. They lean to the right. Devoted Christians, which way do they lean? Look, I know Biden's a Catholic, but in general, and I'm not just talking about the evangelical right, but includes them, devoted churchgoers kind of lean to the right too. So when you look at the Native population, especially in Arizona, It's nice to say that the native vote swung towards the Democrats, but again, let's be honest, ballots are secret. Nobody can hold them up and say, okay, this native person voted this way. No, they do exit polling. Don't know how accurate that is because, yes, the liberals among native people who vote are going to come out and they're going to wave they're going to say, I voted. They're going to have their sticker and all that other stuff. But grandpa, and I say grandpa and veterans, and let's be clear, the male population, the older male population amongst native people, in all likelihood, lean farther to the right than they do to the left. I mean, look at those people who've reached elected office. Charles Curtis, most people don't even know who Charles Curtis is. Charles Curtis was the vice president, the heartbeat away from the presidency. He was Caw. He was a Kansas congressman, Republican, who then ran for the Senate, so he was a Kansas senator, and ultimately was the vice president. I think it was under Coolidge. I could be wrong, but I think it's Coolidge. He was the vice president, a Republican. Remember Ben Nighthorse Campbell? Ben Campbell? He had some reservations about the whole Nighthorse thing because he didn't want to be tokenized as a native politician. He ran as a Democrat and then switched parties. He became a Republican. He retired as a Republican senator. What about Tulsi Gabbard? Remember her? Well, it's not hard to remember her. She's on the campaign trail today for Donald Trump. She was elected as a Democrat, switched parties. So when you tell me that native people lean to the left, and I saw, in fact, I was quoted in a column that was written, and they said native people lean approximately 11% towards the left. I don't know that that's true. I seriously question that. I'm not saying that we clearly lean to the right, but I think we do marginally. And again, these are political leanings, not registered voters. I'm just saying political leanings. So I question the whole idea that native people won the election. But if that's what you believe, and then you go to Arizona and issue an apology for a crime, but never call it a crime, for genocide, but never call it genocide, you merely call it a sin, with the hope that you're going to energize voters to come out for Kamala Harris? Look, I got to admit that I quietly hope Donald Trump loses. I don't expect it. I detest Donald Trump, but I'm not crazy about Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or Deb Haaland or any of these, any of the Democrats. And look, I'm doing this from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. Our relationship with Democrats at the state level, it ain't good either. Hasn't been for many, many years. The Cuomos, the Pattersons, the Spitzers, and Hochul, yeah. No, they've all really had a lot of animosity, outright racism towards Native people. So again, make no mistake about it. I'm not a fan of Democrats, but doesn't mean that I favor Republicans. I don't lean to the right. In fact, I detest the notion that this capitalist society that is bolstered by billionaires. There's so much that is wrong with the United States. But it's designed this way. Look, this isn't the United States coming apart. This is the United States fulfilling its destiny. The anger and the vitriol between the right and the left. Look, as much as I acknowledge that the right and the left are, we call it the two wings of the same bird. I don't pretend that the right and the left don't really dislike each other. But they also really, really do align on many issues. Not just Israel. That's just an example. But aggression and the things that I feel strongly about, things like the legal doctrines that have been used against Native people, both the right and the left agree on it. Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited the doctrine of Christian discovery against Native people. in 2005. The current justices, all of them, Sotomayor, Hagan, all of them, Jackson, they still all endorse plenary powers. You know the one justice who doesn't support the plenary powers doctrine? Clarence Thomas, of all people. I'm not saying he doesn't wish that it exists, that it had, constitutional support, but he says it doesn't. He's the only justice that challenges the notion that Congress should be bestowed with plenary powers over Native people. Both the right and the left primarily do. He's the only one. I can't crawl inside that crazy head of his. I think there's another agenda that's still anti-Native, don't get me wrong. But he's the only Supreme Court justice who's challenged this notion of plenary powers. And it gets, with every case that ever goes before the Supreme Court, that is the argument. Challenging ICWA, even, the gaming law, the, McGirt decision, every one of those things always cites that Congress, that it's settled law, that Congress has this power. Both sides agree with that. So who could I support? If I wanted to. I mean, look, I would never vote, but I can't even endorse a candidate. I can't even say, folks, get out there and vote for Kamala Harris because she's a better choice than Donald Trump. She might be, but I'm not going to say that because I have some serious problems with what this administration did, both with Deb Haaland, how much they failed to step up for the Seneca Nation in their fights, in their struggles over gaming. This final report and the initial report on residential schools, I'm outraged by it. I'm also outraged by the fact that nobody else seems outraged. And then the apology. So you knew I had to come on and do a show on this. I just had to. I had to do a show on Joe Biden's apology. But let me just say, your apology is not accepted. I reject it. And while I know this president is not going to address any of the other 7 recommendations, which are pitiful in of themselves because they leave out so much, I don't believe the next president will either, even if it's Kamala Harris. And make no mistake about it, Deb Haaland has already suggested that she will not be around for a second term, even if the Democrats hold. Now, maybe she'll change her mind, but she hasn't worked out for us anyway. I'd rather have a white person in that position that I could feel free to beat on. Because with Deb Haaland there, nobody wants to criticize her work. Everybody wants to pray, wow, she's worked so hard. She's worked hard for 4 years to make this apology happen. We should at least acknowledge that. No. For one thing, if there's an expression that I've had trouble with, and my buddy Ed Schindler was the one who really pointed this out to me. At least are 2 of the worst words in the English language. Because if you say at least, you're already compromising everything that comes after that. Well, at least this didn't happen. Well, at least 18,000 children, at least 1,000 children died. When you throw those 2 words in front of it, you what you're saying is what comes after it is meaningless. So, no, I'm not going to sit there and say, well, at least Deb Haaland did this, because she didn't, and nor did this administration. I want to thank you for listening. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native.